Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. This channel examines critical issues in the world. Today's presentation is titled 32 Reasons Why NATO Should Be Dissolved. Hence, the purpose of this presentation is to identify the possible reasons why NATO should be dissolved in order to ensure world peace. To do so, it is necessary to briefly look at the history of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The victorious Allied powers which fought together during the Second World War now turned into ideological enemies after the war. The democratic and capitalistic United States and its Western allies fell out with the socialistic and communistic Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies. They formed the two most powerful military alliances, namely the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact. This is the emblem of NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established on April 4, 1949 in Washington, D.C. It was established by 12 countries including Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. NATO was established to accomplish three goals. One, to deter Soviet and communist expansionism. The West felt that the Soviet Union might want to spread communism throughout the world against strategic Western interests. Therefore, the West had a moral duty to contain the expansion. Two, to forbid this revival of nationalistic militarism in Europe through North American presence in the continent. Here, the belief was that American military presence in Europe will help to stabilize the continent by reducing nationalism among the European nations, and thirdly, to encourage European integration. On the other hand, the Warsaw Pact was a military alliance that was also known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance that was established on May 14, 1955 in Warsaw, Poland. That is why it is called Warsaw Pact. It was established by the Soviet Union and Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Poland, which constituted the Eastern Bloc to counterbalance NATO and the Western Bloc. Thus, the Warsaw Pact countered NATO and NATO countered the Warsaw Pact militarily. This is the emblem of the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War erupted due to the ideological differences between the two blocs. So the two superpowers, that is the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies, fought the Cold War indirectly by waging the war in other parts of the world and to avoid direct confrontation since they both possess multiple nuclear warheads. The fear was that if they fight directly, then the world could be destroyed because of the nuclear weapons. Hence, the decision to fight indirectly. The Cold War started in 1947 and ended on December 26, 1991. It could be argued that the last major war fought during the Cold War was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on December 24, 1979. The war lasted until February 15, 1989. This meant that the Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan for 9 years before it withdrew. The war was very devastating to Afghanistan and its people. It should also be noted that the Cold War extended to Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas, backed by the Soviet Union, fought against the Contras, backed by the United States. The Cold War was very destructive to the world as the two power blocs waged wars in parts of Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as the Middle East. Joshua Goldstein estimated that about 7 million people lost their lives as a result of the Cold War. As seen on this map, the areas in blue represent NATO members, and the areas in red and pink represents the Warsaw Pact countries. This is a geographic representation of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was finally dissolved on July 1, 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. As soon as the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc dissolved, NATO had no longer a threatening political and military enemy to contend with. Therefore, NATO would have also been dissolved in response to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in order to bring peace and harmony to Europe and the world. It is fervently argued that the disadvantages of the US and its Western allies continue to maintain NATO far outweigh the advantages. Therefore, it should be dissolved. Indeed, it is a contradiction for the Western geopolitical zone that claims to promote democracy, freedom of speech, and human rights to also be the region that promotes militarism in the world through the perpetuation of NATO. Therefore, these are the reasons why NATO should be dissolved. 1. The fact that the democratic West was the first geopolitical zone to create a military alliance immediately after the Second World War sets the motion rolling for the Cold War, which victimized many countries and millions of people in the world for 45 years. Second, the primary purpose of NATO's existence disappeared as soon as the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were dissolved. Third, the failure to dissolve NATO turned it into an offensive military alliance because it threatened Russia and the rest of the world. Thus, NATO countries have been the most militaristic since the end of the Second World War. There are many examples to cite from. A. NATO started expanding eastward towards Russia as soon as the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. B. NATO attacked Serbia from March 24 to June 10, 1999. C. NATO members participated in the Afghan War by assisting the US from August 2003 to December 2014. NATO members continued to support the US through the Resolute Support Mission until September 2021. D. NATO members participated in the Iraqi War. E. NATO's threat of eastward expansion prompted Russia to attack the Republic of Georgia on August 7, 2008 in order to stop it from joining NATO. F. NATO attacked and destabilized Libya and killed President Muammar Gaddafi the way it did to President Saddam Hussein of Iraq. G. NATO's threat of eastward expansion instigated the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. 4. NATO's continuing presence contributes to anti-Western feelings in the non-Western world. The reason is that there is apprehension in the non-Western world that NATO is now the new instrument for the possible Western military conquest and recolonization of the non-Western world. There are many examples to cite from. A. Due to the belief that NATO is responsible for igniting the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many non-Western countries refuse to join the West in condemning Russia. B. The more NATO officials speak about the organization, the more countries want to join China and Russia because they see NATO as a threat since there is no counterbalancing military alliance in the world to checkmate it militarily. 5. The need for unanimity in NATO's decision-making process fosters a groupthink behavior that prevents critical thinking and rational analysis of issues by Western leaders. 6. It fosters a sense of we versus them mentality among its members, thereby dividing the world into enemy zones. 7. It creates enemies where there are none. 8. It compels the West to think of China and Russia mostly in military terms, thereby creating unnecessary tension in the world. 9. Due to focusing excessively on the military aspects. Due to NATO, the USA and its Western allies failed to develop a dynamic economic and infrastructural development program for African, Asian, Caribbean, Latin American, and Middle Eastern countries for over 50 years. 10. China seized upon the failure of the West to create the Belt and Road Initiative, which has contributed greatly to the economic and infrastructural development of non-Western countries. 11. NATO forces its European members to act as colonies of the United States rather than as sovereign states. 12. It forces Western political leaders to act hypocritically. 13. It leads to the militarization of Europe because the European nations constantly think of military power, as if that is the only thing in the world. 14. It reignites militarism among European states like Britain, France, and Germany, and this can lead to future major wars among the Europeans. 15. The Eastern European members seemed motivated to join NATO with the intention of using it to clamp down on Russia, while Western European members are less committed militarily to doing so. 16. NATO is compelling the United States to overextend its strategic military interests. In order to ensure the viability of NATO, the US has military bases all over the world. In fact, it has about 750 or more military bases. Now, in the event of a major war, there is no way the United States will be able to protect all these bases. 18. Due to the overextension of its military capability, the US is spending almost $1 trillion on defense in peacetime, while underspending in other critical areas. For instance, the US spent about $877 billion on defense in 2022. This is about 12% of all federal spending in that year, and that is a lot of money. 19. Since there is no counterbalancing military force to checkmate NATO, the US is embroiling itself in thorny European ethnic and political affairs that could imperil it in the future. It should be noted that in the early part of US history, the political leaders of the country made a conscious effort not to entangle it in messy European affairs. Membership in NATO has reversed the policy by compelling the US to police Europe due to being actively involved in directing military affairs in Europe. The US is being sidetracked from paying attention to other parts of the world. 21. NATO forces US policymakers to increasingly view the world from a singular perspective. 22. US policymakers become agitated when the American point of view is not accepted as the only solution to a problem by the rest of the world. 23. NATO threats led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting gradual rearmament of Germany and Japan. In fact, in the future, Germany and Japan will also become powerful military nations that will end up counterbalancing the US interests. 24. The continuing existence of NATO is a threat that is likely to result in the formation of other military alliances to counterbalance it. 25. Due to differences in strategic interests, the relationship between the US and its European allies could be strained as the Europeans feel that the US is overreaching and not allowing them to make decisions for their continent. This map shows how NATO is expanding eastwards. You can see all the areas in blue represents NATO, and Russia, which is in the red, is pushed eastwards. 26. The greatest beneficiary of NATO is the military-industrial complex that President Dwight Eisenhower warned the US about. 27. NATO contributed immensely toward the Western tendency to singularize, ideologize, and militarize complex issues in the world. There are many examples to cite from. Hence, A. France waged bloody wars by refusing to grant independence to Algeria and Vietnam. B. Portugal waged bloody wars by refusing to grant independence to Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. C. NATO members supported apartheid South Africa on the ground that they were fighting to stop the spread of communism. D. NATO members supported the UDR in Rhodesia on the ground that they were fighting to stop the expansion of communism. E. Due to ideologization of issues as a result of NATO membership, the members staged insurrections, military coups, and civil wars in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. F. Due to the ideologization of the liberation struggle, the West missed the opportunity to serve as the beacon of freedom, political rights, and democracy in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. 28. Due to NATO's policies and actions in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s and 1990s, African, many Asian, Middle Eastern, Caribbean, and Latin American countries are increasingly moving away from the Western strategic orbit to seek more fulfilling relationships that could boost their infrastructural and economic development and ensuring their political stability. 29. Due to groupthink that NATO foists on its members, they continue to singularize, ideologize, and militarize global issues, thereby making it difficult for Western leaders to think outside the box in order to respond to the changing global system that is increasingly multipolar. 30th, hence, when Western leaders speak about Western values, democracy, and human rights, such views are not convincing to the non-Western world. that has experienced firsthand the militaristic posture that the West has adopted for decades. 31. If NATO is not dissolved, other military alliances will come into being, thereby reigniting another round of Cold War that could be more destructive due to advancements in military technology. And finally, 32. NATO's active military support for Ukraine in the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war could trigger a third world war if it is not stopped, since Russia increasingly feels that it is actually fighting NATO and not Ukraine. Conclusion. When the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were dissolved, NATO lost its justification for being a defensive alliance. Hence, it turns into an offensive military alliance with the resultant attack on Serbia and Libya and an active participation in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. NATO compels Western policymakers to view the world from a groupthink perspective that is making it difficult for the West to convince the non-Western world about its motives. NATO turns its European members to act as colonies of the US due to groupthink. NATO forces the US to pay undue attention to Europe, thereby undercutting its strategic interests in the non-Western world. The Eastern European motive for joining NATO is different from the strategic interests of Western Europe and the United States. NATO could end up stirring anti-US feelings in Europe because of the perception that the US is lording over the European countries. Purpose of world peace. NATO needs to be disbanded like the Warsaw Pact. NATO dissolution will enable the US and its West European allies to think outside the box and develop better ways of relating to the world. The dissolution of NATO will enable the US and its European allies to re-strategize and develop new policies and ways of relating to a multipolar global system. The dissolution of NATO will eliminate the view that the democratic West is also the most militaristic geopolitical zone in the world. Moreover, it will put an end to the contradiction between promoting democracy, freedom of speech, political rights, and human rights, and militarism, which NATO represents. It should be noted that the non-Western world is never convinced when Western political leaders and activists speak about Western values because they are aware of the militaristic nature of the geopolitical zone during the colonial era and after the Second World War. Thank you for listening to these presentations. Please do not fail to subscribe to the channel.